Cool. Thank you very much for coming. It's real fun to be here. So I'm a lapsed computational neuroscientist from Sweden who ended up in the philosophy department in Oxford. And I always appreciate the chance of getting out of our little bubble outside the ring road. So I'm really happy to have actually managed to break free of the matrix and actually visiting the real world now. Okay, so the topic is kind of loosely transhumanism. That is, I'm going to talk about a lot of stuff I find really interesting that relates to technology and being human and how we might modify ourselves and the future and our place in the universe. And as you can guess, this can get rather broad. So you feel free to try to steer me, to ask questions, and we can see how to adjust, because I can of course go on endlessly about everything here. And while we might all agree that could be fun, it might be a rather long evening. So let's start. So I'm at the Future of Humanity Institute, and we are the weird part of the philosophy department in Oxford. So essentially our remit is to try to think about the big picture, the far ahead questions. The Oxford Martin School, which was founded when James Martin donated a heck of a lot of money to Oxford. Even by Oxford standard, this was a big donation. The size of the donation was so big that he got to set up whatever he wanted. So the Martin School is trying to solve the big problems for the 21st century. So we have various institutes doing climate, stem cells, nanotechnology, ethics and law in armed conflict and so on. And we are kind of the people sitting in the top of the tallest mast and looking at the horizon and trying to figure out what's out there that nobody is thinking about. Especially the things that nobody else is thinking about, because a little bit of research can go a long way when you're first doing that. And of course, most weird, far out questions are pointless. Most of them will never be more than an interesting intellectual exercise. But occasionally they might turn out to be rather important, and then we hopefully can shout down towards the rest of the ship, telling them, hey, look over there. There is something really interesting and scary over there. So, in my case, I'm a neuroscientist, and like zombies, of course, we love brains. And yeah, it's true. These are lovely pictures from the Minnesota Brain Museum. Also a wonderful place, if you're a zombie or a neuroscientist. And here we have a comparison between a human brain and a chimpanzee brain. And they have a slightly different sizes, so there is a magnification, but I think most of you can't tell them apart very much. And even if you're a neuroscientist, you actually need to squint a fair bit to figure out which is which. The difference is not that profound. It's just that we got more brain, but all the parts in the chimp brain we have. There might be some slight differences in the number of particular kinds of neurons, but it's not like we have particular connections or a particular module that seems to be lacking physically in the chimp brain. However, our behavior is fairly different. So about 5 or 7 million years ago, our shared ancestor gave rise to one lineage that led to us and another lineage that led to the chimps. And this common ancestor probably lived a life very much like current chimps. Hunting and gathering in the forest, being prey for bigger predators. And that was it. And 5 million years later, suddenly the chimps have found that there are metal birds flying in the sky, the weird hairless chimps around with metal rods that make banging noises, and suddenly a lot of the predators have just disappeared, together with the forest. It's very confusing for the chimps, insofar they actually even notice what's going on. The biggest problem for the chimps right now is that they're very much at mercy of our species, and they don't even know that fact. So what really happened? Well, the difference between a chimp brain and a human brain is rather small, but they do exist. We are way better at planning. We seem to have a working memory that allows us to keep more things going in our heads at the same time than chimp. Essentially, our mental control over what we're imagining at any moment in time seems to be slightly better. we seem to have a slightly better innate sense of physics. We can come up with, if I push that, then that will fall down and hit that thing. Chimps can do that to some extent, but we humans are significantly better. Human children can learn certain things chimps never seem to be able to learn in simple physics tricks. But most importantly, of course, we talk to each other. And it's not just that we communicate very efficiently. We can communicate about anything we agree to communicate about. We have an open-ended language, and we also have a cumulative culture. We come up with ideas, and then we tell them to our kids, and they continue telling them. This has enormous effects, because using the simple physics engine we seem to be having somewhere in our brains, our communication, and our cumulative culture, we quickly started coming up with tricks, which enabled us to do things like agriculture, and guns, and airplanes, and environmental conservation. So we have taken over the planet. We are actually the most common large animal in our weight class. The only competition is actually our domestic animals. Most of the animal biomass on the Earth's surface today is actually in cattle and humans. And that is because we have set up the ecosystem to work for our benefit. Not always very wisely, but we certainly have an enormous effect. We're actually the most powerful erosive force on rock right now. We're eroding more rock by blowing up mountains and digging tunnels and making roads than the natural erosion is doing. And we're now fixating more nitrogen than microorganisms are doing. And this is impressive because nitrogen fixation is one of the cornerstones of the Earth's biosphere. And less than 100 years ago, Haber and Bosch kind of came up with the idea of how to do it. And since then, we actually have started fixating more nitrogen than the rest of the biosphere. Again, very much to our benefit and to the benefit of a lot of species, but it kind of transformed the planet. And the chimps still don't get it. And the poor chimps are pretty unlikely to figure out what's going on either. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, all of these tricks we have has led to an enormous growth of various things. So essentially, you can start looking at human population and the total wealth, and how we reduce the death rate. And essentially, we have loads of curves, most of them pointing upwards in radical ways. And it doesn't matter really what they are about. I can just hand-wave say, oh yes, it's all exponential, one way or another. It's very convenient. Well, sometimes they go downwards, but that's still an exponential thing. Something is getting cheaper at an exponential rate. Yeah, so this is kind of a standard Kurzweil story. Yeah, everything is getting better. Everything is awesome. Except, of course, the slight problem of having several billion people on the same planet with a lot of rather powerful technologies in their hands. And of course, there is this totally cosmic, awesome thing that actually 7.2 billion people, that's an enormous amount of minds and experience. So we have kind of changed the rules for this planet. The biosphere is not working like it used to. Once upon a time, organisms reproduced, they evolved, ecosystems came and went, and now one species have kind of taken over. It's not like we can totally transform the planet yet, but if you extrapolate these curves, it looks pretty likely that, yeah, right now we're doing accidental climate change. It's not at all implausible that soon we will be doing deliberate climate change, and it's going to be essentially under cultural control. Now, this has led a little bit to a situation like this. We are, on one hand, really smart, really powerful, and we have tools that allow us to control the world. On the other hand, we're sitting right in this world that we actually don't quite understand, and our brain is not that different from the chimp brain. The problem is, we are essentially the most stupid technological species there can be. Because our intelligence evolved probably towards some kind of threshold level where we took off. But that was not that we took off in becoming much smarter. Rather, we took off in the form of getting better stone tools, building larger organizations, coordinating better, getting agriculture and books and culture and civilization. The brains didn't get much larger. And now we're sitting here with nuclear weapons and cloud services and very complicated systemic risks. And some of them we realize we actually have no clue how to do. The classic example is that nobody in the world knows how to make a microprocessor. We have a general theoretical understanding, of course, I think most of us, but in practice, how you take silicon and actually turn it into a useful processor, yeah, that's distributed across hundreds or thousands of minds, organizations and tools, and if those disappeared, it would be rather tough to reinvent it. Or if something turned out to be wrong, it would be very hard to find where the problem is without this big infrastructure. So maybe it would be a good idea to figure out if we can become slightly smarter than that monkey, or at least figure out how to get out of the high voltage cabinet. And this is of course part of the human condition. So one of the oldest epics is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a real classic. It starts with the classic bromance, and then King Gilgamesh loses his beloved Enkidu. Depends a little bit on how much you want to read into that story, how close they were. But he realized, oh dear, I'm mortal. I'm gonna die someday. I need to do something about it. And of course, like in any epic, he goes out on a quest to find the herb of immortality, and he meets various gods and monsters that help and hinder him. And in the end, the herb gets stolen by a snake, which is why all the snakes are immortal and we humans are mortal. Now, the moral of the story is partially, of course, to keep humans happy by saying, we're mortal, but we can understand that, but we have to accept the will of the gods or fate or something. But it's really because we are an animal species that realize, hey, we're mortal and we don't quite like that. Life is pretty good. And I don't want to be sick and unhealthy and die and lose my loved ones. What if we could change that? So of course, for a very long time, people have been trying to change it. There are interesting stories about the Chinese alchemists realizing that mercury compounds, they seem to impair a rotting process fairly well. So if you ingest a lot of mercury, you should be able to slow down aging and disease. Great idea until the emperor tried a little bit too much and died. And after that, the surviving alchemists all agreed breathing exercises and meditation. And we have been trying this as a species for a very long time. People have been trying to figure out ways around the bad parts of the human condition. Or people have been trying to come up with a good explanation why those bad parts aren't that bad. Now, transhumanism is very much about thinking that, actually, those bad parts maybe are bad and we ought to change them if we can. And we're now getting more and more technology that might actually allow that change. So when we talk about the human condition, some parts are of course very good. We want to be social, we want to love and be loved, and that's not something we want to get rid of. But what if we could love better? What if we could live for a longer time? And is it such a great idea to sleep as much as we do? What if we could get rid of sleep? Would that be a great idea? In parentheses, that's probably actually a bad idea for very subtle reasons. And the interesting part here is, of course, once you start thinking about these changes, can you implement them? And people have been thinking about it for a long time, but now we start to get the technologies enough that we can actually tinker with ourselves. Just like we learn how to tinker with the material world on the outside, we actually gotten fairly decent at modifying biology and having technology that interface with us. It also leads to another interesting thought. Okay, things have been speeding up and our species is kind of making its own rules as it's going along. So the future might actually be radically different from our current one. You don't necessarily have to buy into this Kurzweil, everything is exponential, view of things to accept that the future could be radically different. Even if you're a pessimist, you might agree, we could mess things up a big time. If Earth is a smoking crater, that's certainly a different future. It's just one that's very bad. Also, the future might be much weirder. We might actually do things that didn't exist in the past. And this leads to this interesting question, is it a good idea to try to do something radically different? And transhumanism very much says that, given that there are some awesome things you can do and experience as a human, it seems likely that there might be even more awesome things in the realm of trans or post-human possibilities. After all, we have culture, we have science, we have sports and religion and a lot of things we appreciate as humans that the chimps simply don't get. If the chimps were to discuss what we would want to become in the future, you might say, oh, we want to have a power to get more bananas. And indeed, we humans can get an enormous amount of bananas. But we kind of realize, after the first pile of bananas, there are better things to do. And then we do things that leave the chimps very confused. It might be that in the future, our descendants, or even ourselves, might be able to do things that we have no clue about. They might also appreciate many of the things we regard as valuable. But they have other things that say, oh yes, that's much better. Just like having a good art experience is better than a pile of bananas. This thing is way better than art. Unfortunately, you can't understand it because you have a slightly too small brain. Which leads to the interesting question whether it would be even rational for us to seek it out. But the post-human might say, yeah, it would be really stupid of you not to try. Which leads to a good philosophical question of what we should do. So one interesting thing is, how do we even reason about this? And this is where I'm happy I'm hanging out with philosophers, because philosophy works rather well when you start discussing with scientists. Because in philosophy, you're actually interested in domains where we don't know what we're doing. And then we try to get some kind of order. Meanwhile, in science and engineering, we actually work on stuff where we have a clue what we're doing. When the philosophers get their act together about something, it moves out and becomes its own department. Natural science, economics, sociology, and psychology, and everybody still wonders what the philosophers are good for. But you can, of course, try to be a bit scientific about exploring this weird space. So we know there are some things that the laws of nature simply rule out. It looks very likely that you can move things faster than the speed of light. Quantum mechanics put some very tricky limits on the kind of computation information we can have. We also know that what we can do, the small blue corner there, and then there's this white space of other stuff that it would be allowed by the laws of physics if we just put together the right stuff in the right way. We don't know how to do that yet. So we can use some principles here to reason about what might be good. So one thing is, if nature is doing it, we seem to be pretty good at copying what nature is doing. In some cases, we simply do it by picking up nature and putting it in a pot in the window. We can control biology simply by various forms of gardening, agriculture, and later on, of course, biotechnology and genetic engineering. And we know that various forms of information processing that happens in nature, it's fairly easy to steal them. And we have even found ways of doing information processing that are better in nature. So many of the things that seem to go on, in the long run, it's very likely that we can do it too. We already have self-replicating machines. They're called computer viruses and computer worms. They're maybe not the best application, but when you think about it, that's essentially somebody has created life and he uses it to send spam. Yeah, we are not a very wise species. It's also interesting that when we automate tasks, you really amplify them. It's one thing for a human to do something, but as soon as you can actually make a machine do it, typically it gets done a lot more, or a lot more with a lot more energy. And a human can run, but if you put a wheel on a car or a bike, you can move faster. And once you automate production of something, typically you get orders of magnitude more of it, whether that is making gadgets or adding numbers. Also, it might be that we automate more and more of the automation, which leads to very interesting feedback loops. And of course, this leads to a very profound thing. Scale might actually not be a problem. Once upon a time, if you didn't have enough people to dig ditches or build pyramids, you couldn't make a bigger ditch or a bigger pyramid. If you can automate it, scale becomes less of a problem. Now you have tractors and so on. If you can make self-replicating machines or machines that build machines, the scale can become much bigger, much faster. So in the long run, the scale of what we might be doing as a civilization might actually just be limited by those borders of physics. Essentially, how much mass energy do we have available, how much time, and how much information processing can we throw at the problem. These are rather profoundly big and unsettling questions, especially when we start thinking about ourselves. So let's get over to the wonderful topic of health. This is the definition of health according to the World Health Organization. And thanks to this definition, we know that nobody in this room is healthy. In fact, no human has ever been healthy. I really love this definition because it's something aspirational. This is what we should be aiming for. It just got rather hard to achieve. However, we're not that bad at achieving it. We have realized that aging is a pretty bad thing. And generally, we don't like being sick. What's so bad about being sick, besides the things like pain and sneezing and things like that? Well, it stops us from achieving our life goals. We have various ideas we try to achieve, some various forms of well-being, and being healthy is a kind of prerequisite for that. And we are getting better at it. So this is a plot of a maximum lifespan in the country in the world, the average lifespan in the country in the world that has the highest lifespan over time. And it's essentially a straight line. So if nothing else, you should know that while giving this talk, your life expectancy is ticking up a little bit. Unfortunately, you're still aging a little bit faster, but your life expectancy is increasing. And this has been going on for a long while. Those horizontal lines, however, are predictions about where it's going to end. And as you can see, they have consistently been broken. The interesting thing about this diagram is that at the start, back in the 1800s, questions were mostly about food. The reason people were living longer was you could get more calories, so you were a little bit healthier. Later, you got other tools like sanitation, and then antibiotics, and then various forms of vaccination, and then all the modern scientific healthcare. You have a lot of very different tools here from living longer and better. And they all sum up around into a roughly straight line, which is a bit like Moore's law. Moore's law is really fascinating because we've been changing technology quite a lot. We have been thinking about how to make microprocessors and microchips in very different ways throughout the decades. Yet it produces a roughly straight line. And the same thing seems to be going on about aging. The problem might be, of course, that if this continues indefinitely, we're going to be very long-lived in a few hundred years, but that's not very fun for us here, because we are going to be rather grey and dead by that point. But quite a lot of people think we can do something about that. And of course, it's already changing society. So this is a kind of typical print from Sweden in the 1800s. There is a lot of versions of this, but this shows the ages of man, like a kind of staircase. And at different ages, you're supposed to be different things. You're supposed to play around as a kid and eventually get into romance. And then, of course, the supreme thing to be is some kind of politician. And afterwards, it's just downhill. The interesting part here is, of course, that all societies have this idea about, yeah, life has this structure. Many would like to say life is like a book. It has a beginning, middle, and an end, and you better not change that. However, books can be of different lengths. Some are rather short pamphlets, unfortunately, and others are kind of 7+ volumes of fantasy epics. And I think many of us would actually like to be that kind of fantasy epic. The interesting part is also that as we have started to live longer, we have invented new ages. So when this was actually made, teenagers didn't exist. Teenagers were invented in the 1950s. Because at that point, there was actually space enough for people who were not kids and not adults. And gradually we've been expanding teenagehood up until about 35 these days. And that's rational, because you need to learn so much before you can actually take part in modern society. And there are so many possibilities that actually makes sense to play around for a fairly long while. And this is a response to this relatively modest increase. We have doubled lifespans in many countries over the past century using these normal means. And we have hence invented new ages. Right now people are inventing what to do after you retire. It seems to be some people decide that's where I'm starting my startup. And it has interesting effects about the flow of wealth in society. Once upon a time, you would inherit the farm about the time where you're old enough to run the farm. Now you might inherit it about the time you want to retire. And that might, of course, change even more if we get some of the interesting stuff. I think many of you recognize Aubrey de Grey, who's kind of the biggest spokesperson of actually doing something proper scientific about aging and slowing it down. So he's been a bit of a gadfly to the biogerontology community, who for a long time really don't want to be associated with anybody trying to make the people age more slowly, because that's of course the realm of those alchemists with the mercury elixirs. Snake oil is bad for getting funding in science. So they didn't want to hear that. And I remember when I read my first textbook about the biology of aging, and it was very uncertain what was causing the aging and what was going on, and very skeptical about we could do anything about it. And this was in the 90s. And since the 90s we have quite a lot of lab animals where we can slow down aging or various parts of the aging process. We have gotten a pretty decent idea what's going on. So the question is, why aren't we doing more about it? And the typical response is that people say, yeah, but aging is natural, but so is pain. And while pain is doing something rather useful at first, after a while it becomes an ache that is actually just a problem. And indeed, the suffering and death caused by aging is a pretty serious problem. More interesting is that Aubrey, his program on fixing aging, we can discuss that later, the details of it. Again, it was his battle plan, and a lot of traditional biogerontologists were kind of poo-pooing it, except that now, if you look at the manifestos from the biogerontology community, they're essentially saying the same thing, except that they don't mention Aubrey. Aubrey is rather smug about that, which I think he should. That doesn't mean we know exactly how to stop aging well. We have various interesting tools, which I'm happy to discuss during the questions section. But right now, it's still going to take a while, which is kind of bad for us who happen to be aging. But it looks like that trend might actually change. And some of my friends in the insurance business, they're a bit worried about it. If you run a pension fund, you need to care about how much aging people are going to do 50 years down the line. And if there is even 1% chance that you slow down the rate of aging, that's a big deal over in the city. So they are kind of starting to take that very seriously, because there is a lot of money on the line here. However, I'm happier to talk about brains. Again, a bit like a zombie, I just returned to brains. So I've been doing a lot of research about cognitive enhancement. Essentially the question, can we make brains work better? And the good news is, we have a lot of tools that work for that. Some of them are trivial, like don't drink water with lead in it. Yeah, and sleep well, and exercise. And to some degree, of course, modern Western civilization have achieved that fairly well. Then there are other tools like education and mental training. The ones that are really interesting are, of course, the ones that are new and controversial, which I'm going to run through rather quickly, because I have a feeling that I'm totally going to run out of time. But education gives you about 2.7 IQ point up until university level, where it kind of levels off. And it's interesting because this is a form of enhancement of brains that we think is so great that we make it mandatory. Despite that, it's really costly and takes a lot of time and effort. Another enhancement is, of course, exercise. I always show this slide to show the effect of aerobic exercise on the brain, reading comprehension and maths ability, and it's really good. I have a gym literally under my office, and I have never ever set my foot inside that gym because it's tiresome. You get sweaty. I don't like exercising. I want a pill for that. And this is, of course, the problem with many forms of enhancement. Many of them require quite a lot of work before you get an improved performance. But still, if you jog, you are actually improving your brain, probably because you get growth factors released from the muscles, and then somehow, nobody has really figured out how they cross the blood-brain barrier or whether there is some sympathetic thing going on, because those growth factors also seem to affect a bit of neural growth. It's really a very weird question why that works. And I'm of course interested, can you make a pill or something that does that? Another cumbersome way of getting slightly smarter is computer training. So this is the NBack task, where you get various locations and letters, and occasionally need to say, where was the thing that was 3 steps back? Or what letter did you see 5 steps back? And you can make it harder, of course, by forcing people to keep more stuff in their working memory. And the cool thing is we can train working memory this way quite profoundly, and it does seem to carry over to at least some intelligence tests. We don't know whether it actually makes you smarter in real life, but at least on the intelligence tests, it does have a positive effect. But again, you need to spend at least half an hour every morning playing these games to keep on edge. This is, of course, why pills and herbs are so popular. Because we might say, oh, I just need to take this herbal remedy and then I'm smarter and happier. Again, that's not how it works, unfortunately, but at least one can try. And people have been trying this for a long while. Ginkgo biloba, which is another interesting Chinese elixir, is probably not very powerful. It seems to improve the blood circulation in the brain, so it might be helpful if you're fairly old, but doesn't seem to help healthy people. On the other hand, Adderall, which is a mix of amphetamine salts, does have effect in healthy young people. And indeed, a fair number of students are trying it out. Indeed, beta blockers, since they reduce stage fright, are apparently fairly popular among classical musicians. There are some interesting papers looking at what does they do to the music quality. And apparently, technically, it becomes better, but the vibrato of the sopranos is kind of lower, and the piano is kind of technically perfect, but a bit emotionally flat. We have students, of course, who might be taking these ones. Whenever I'm lecturing in Oxford, of course, I get a whole gaggle of students afterwards who want to discuss the drug experiences, and especially how to optimize it. And I think that is an important thing, because if you take a stimulant like Adderall, you're getting more energy. That's useful if you have to write an essay, and it is actually a memory enhancer. The problem is, then the students take Adderall and they do an all-nighter before the exam. And they forget that now they have not been sleeping very much, and sleeping is important for memory consolidation, taking all that learning and turning it into long-term memory. So next morning, they don't remember very much. That's kind of, they're missing the right use of it. So if you want to enhance your brain this way, you better know what task you want to enhance yourself on. Of course, there is a big debate about whether it's even a good thing for students to enhance themselves, but what about the faculty? Like Paul Erdős, the mathematician up in the corner there. He was one of the most productive mathematicians of the 20th century, and he happened to like amphetamine. There is an anecdote that a friend was worried that he was addicted and bet $300 with him that, oh, I bet you can't stay off amphetamine. And he won the bet, handily, no problem. But he told the friend, you set mathematics back a month. And I think this shows something interesting. We might care about students learning things in the right way so they know how to solve things even without a pill. But mathematicians, we might mostly care about the truth of their theorems and maybe that the anecdotes about them are amusing. We don't really care how they came about it. Srinivasa Ramanujan, he claimed that the goddess Lakshmi was giving him awesome mathematical theorems in his dreams. It's not like we're saying he was cheating by getting divine inspiration. Again, good anecdote, really awesome theorems, and we didn't care how that happened. So a lot of the ethics about enhancer drugs is that people get confused about what kind of game are we playing. So in sports, there is a problem with doping because we want the sport to be fair and there are certain ideals to uphold. And maybe we want something similar for students. But for the professors, if they produce something useful, we might actually care more about the output. And this, of course, goes even more for things like doctors and truck drivers. We don't want them too sleepy when they're cutting in us or driving around with heavy stuff. And of course, we have airline pilots. So there have been an interesting discussion about how much we might want some professions to be enhanced. In particular, of course, we have our dear political decision makers, who quite often do all-nighters and then come out and say that, yeah, we saved the euro. It was very, very tiresome, but we negotiated all night and now we saved the euro or done some other important decision. Now, if there's one thing psychology knows, is that sleep deprivation is really bad for making rational, good decisions. In fact, staying up all night is essentially equivalent to drinking quite a lot of wine. So if you imagine Cameron coming out from a meeting kind of swinging from bottom, we saved the euro. That's about how bad the decisions would be after an all-nighter. We should, as voters and citizens, actually be very concerned when they make important decisions after this long all-nighter. At least we should hope that we put a bowl of modafinil or some other suitable enhancer on the table in there. In practice, of course, this is more about selling the story that they really care, so there is a sacrifice in sleep for it. And of course, people have been concerned about this for a long time. This is another old Swedish picture showing a drug bust in the year 1800. And you might notice them hiding the coffee. Because, of course, this was the drug coffee. This horrible foreign stimulant destroying the brains of Swedes. The real reason it was banned was actually economical. It had to do with taxation and the theory of the imports and exports. But the king was really keen on getting rid of the coffee. There is even this story that he had two condemned criminals, and one of them was kind of freed on the condition that he drink a cup of coffee every morning. Of course, the police had controlled that and so on to make sure he was not cheating. And the other one was to drink a cup of tea. And then, of course, the king hoped to demonstrate how harmful coffee was. And of course, you know the story. You know who died first. The king. And then, of course, the tea drinker and then the coffee drinker. I don't know whether this is actually a true story, but people have for a long time been very concerned about people taking the wrong kind of drugs. The right kind of drugs, totally, of course. Alcohol is really important in many countries, and that would be totally wrong. It might be that over time we change our views about enhancers too, especially since propranolol, the one that actually a lot of classical music people were taking, also seemed to reduce some forms of racism. It's an interesting question whether we would say that, that's so important that maybe we should put it in the drinking water. It's probably not that smart. But you can modify brains in other fun ways. So this is a way using direct electric stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, so where you oscillate electromagnetic fields, so you induce currents. You can also do a direct current stimulation just by putting electrodes and sending a current. It's amazing, but it actually does stimulate parts of the cortex. If you change polarity, you reduce the activity. So if you find the right spot, you can actually get various enhancement effects of this. The US military has been playing around with this, for example, training people to find bombs in virtual reality, because of course virtual reality is a totally realistic way of training people for finding bombs in the Middle East. And it turns out that, yeah, you can improve brain plasticity. We can learn at least the task of finding the slightly off paper bins or whatever it is we're supposed to look for more quickly. And Roy Cohen-Kadosh over in Oxford, he's been doing this with mathematics ability, and a lot of parents have, of course, immediately contacted him and told him that, could you please zap my kid's brain? It seems to be fairly safe, and indeed it's rather easy to do. So I know several people who are actually doing do-it-yourself brain hacking, except that we don't know about the long-term consequences. And people are actually selling kits. There was a successful Kickstarter a few months ago for Focus, a device that stimulates your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to improve your computer gaming ability. And this is exactly the same stimulation that people in research are trying to apply to cure depression. But in this case, of course, you're only supposed to use it half an hour every day, and it's totally legal because it's not for any medical purpose. It's only to improve your computer gaming ability, which is a rather weird loophole. A lot of the researchers are kind of mildly concerned about this. In many cases, however, it's just a placebo effect. People just buy something and put it on and believe they're getting smarter and better at the game while it's actually training. More interesting, more hardcore modifications are genetic ones. So this is the Doogie mouse, which is one of my favorites. It's got an overexpression of a particular receptor protein, which makes it better at learning. It also makes it slightly more sensitive to inflammatory pain. So it makes this wonderful thought experiment. Would you want to have this modification if it meant that you had more aches? And my answer is, of course, aspirin. Yeah, I'm very happy to have a slightly better learning ability, and I can compensate for it. However, I also realized that actually learning better wouldn't help me that much because I need time management. There is a lot of other things that we might want to enhance. And in general, thinking that we could improve in any direction doesn't mean that that's the smartest direction to improve. You might think about improving humans this way. I don't have the time to get into it, but some of our group have done some calculations on how big impact it could be if you were to do selection. And it looks like in the long run this could be very powerful. Right now it's pretty unlikely to work because parents generally don't select their kids that much. However, we're getting better and better at gene therapy. So this is a very cool paper where we made the colorblind monkeys, or actually we can see in one pair of colors, but now we got an extra protein to recognize color, so we could do these color-based problems. So these are adult monkeys. They're getting transfected with, I think, a virus, and they can, after a while, see a new color. How awesome is that? I really want to have extra colors. I want to be able to see in ultraviolet, so I can see the spring flowers, the patterns they have that the insects use to navigate. Of course, there are small technical problems because actually the lens in my eyes is opaque to ultraviolet light, so there are some technical problems I might need to fix here. But it's interesting because these monkeys are getting something that we would say would be a different conscious experience, and people are indeed getting better and better using gene therapy now. Earlier there was this mention of this girl with leukemia who was actually cured thanks to some of the gene therapy, and we're getting way better. Partially because of some very interesting discoveries with a technique called CRISPR for really kind of cutting and splicing in stuff in the genome rather exactly. Okay, what else? Well, we have of course the idea of actually plugging in things straight into the brain. So on the upper left we got one of the monkeys in Miguel Nicolele's lab. So he's been working on having monkeys control robotic arms. And down there, it was a very early experiment giving a blind patient the sight back. So he actually got electrodes plugged into his visual cortex, connected to a little Toshiba libretto computer, connected to the cameras. He hasn't got a very great vision. According to him, it's a bit like a star field, a few points. But he can walk across a parking lot and actually avoid bumping into the cars, which is kind of impressive for a totally blind person. And people are developing slightly better techniques. Nicolelis is getting pretty good at wiring together, and not just having monkeys control robotic arms, but even connecting both rats and monkeys into a group system that, at least according to one very peculiar paper, seem to be better at problem solving than individuals. And the state of art right now is probably Ted Berger's work, where he's been doing artificial hippocampus chips. So the hippocampus is part of his memory consolidation protocol in the brain, where we're taking the experience of the day and putting them into long-term storage. It tends to get damaged in Alzheimer's, and he has actually demonstrated that he can make an artificial hippocampus that, at least for some simple labyrinth test on the rat, he can not just replace a little bit of damaged tissue, but he can even give them fake memories or enhanced memories, which is really impressive. I never thought he would actually get this far with it when he started. And of course, the really cool thing these days is optogenetics, because putting electrodes into the brain is so 20th century. So this is a beautiful, beautiful method where you, again, put in genes into the cells so they have express proteins that are light sensitive. And then they connect to the membrane proteins that conduct ions in and out. So by shining the right color of laser light, you can stimulate a cell or silence it. And this is probably a kind of gentler way of interfacing with the nervous system without actually having to worry too much about current. I'm totally running out of time, and I've got kind of an endless amount of slides. But basically, I'm going to just jump past so we know what we might converse about. We of course also have our group tools, because we actually outsource a lot of things to other systems and other people. And by having the right software, you can actually solve problems quite efficiently as a group. And then of course we can get our own cyber equipment. To the left there is my own personal wearable I built in the 90s. It's mostly to demonstrate that, yes, I'm equally nerdy now, but these days, of course, all the functions, like imagine that wearable is in my smartphone. which is doing way more than I actually imagined I could be able to do with that wearable. The smartphone has more or less eaten up the wearable, and the Google Glass might actually be relatively irrelevant compared to what's going on in the iPhone. And you can, of course, connect humans in clever ways. So again, the US military has this interesting and mildly creepy system for sentries. You can, of course, have people looking for bad guys creeping up on your position. And this works amazingly well for the first 5 minutes, and then we lose interest, get sleepy and distracted. You can use computer vision to look for bad guys, and it will immediately find bad guys in rocks, clouds, and plants. It will give false alarms all the time. But humans are really good at spotting people and faces. So what if the software is just showing pictures to somebody sitting somewhere in the world in a lab with electrodes on his head? So his visual system signals whenever he sees a face. So this guy is sitting there and just seeing pictures of rocks, clouds, and plants, and occasional Taliban. And that produces the P300 response. You kind of notice, hey, what was that? And you have 10 different people, so you can even do a good statistics on this. And then the camera kind of focuses and tells the subject, hey, look over there, there might be somebody there. It's an interesting case because you're kind of using the human here as a part of a rather complicated system. In this case, you're using the human brain as almost an electronic component. And there are some interesting issues here about agency. Okay, totally running out of time, but that's just fun. So some of you might have seen Neela Harbison, who's got a wonderful sense of color for a colorblind person. So he translates it into sound. So he's got his own aesthetic based on this little device that he's always carrying around, which also means that it's getting integrated in his mind. He hears a color. And this trick works in a lot of other ways. My friend Todd got an implanted magnet in his finger, so he can sense magnetic fields. And it's because the magnet is moving, so he's getting normal neural impulses from touch, except that over time, his brain has adapted and noticed the difference between touch signals and electromagnetic signal. He can tell the difference between a magnetic and a mechanical vibration. He seems to have a different representation in his brain. So the end result might be, of course, that you can do all sorts of enhancements and modifications for all sorts of reasons. This is Australian performance artist Delark, who started his career by hanging himself from hooks from high buildings. And after the 70s, that was done. That kind of nothing new. So then he built a third arm, and he's been connecting himself to the internet, etc., as art. And he can get away with much more than we can, because in academia you need ethics approval, but if you're an artist, yeah, you just do it. And of course, some people modify themselves rather freely by self-expression. I've been emailing with this guy, and he's very eloquent. He's very normal over email, but of course, if you meet him face to face, he's a bit more peculiar. And again, he does this because he wants to be a lizard. So I'm kind of out of time here, so I want to kind of conclude by saying that what I'm given here is a little talk about that we're now pushing towards the limits of what it means to be human and exploring it. And I think it's kind of useful to explore. Not all of these modification enhancements are good. I don't think we all want to look like the lizard man. I think he might bite himself in the cheek quite often, and that probably hurts a lot. Not all of the cognitive enhancements are well advised, and some of them might be expensive and tricky. But I do think we as a species actually are going to take charge of our own evolution and turn into something rather awesome. Thank you.